Hey everyone, and welcome. Just take a look around you for a second. That book on your desk, the news feed on your phone, even that poster on the wall. It all comes back to the incredible story we're going to explore today, the history of print. It's this amazing journey of technology and revolution that took information from being a rare, precious thing to something we see every single day.
All right, so where are we getting this story from? We're diving straight into Chapter 5 of the NCERT Class 10 History textbook. And listen up, if you're a student, you'll want to lean in close. This is a super important chapter for your board exams. And for any UPSC aspirants out there, this is absolutely foundational. We're going to hit all the key points you need to know.
I mean, seriously, just try to picture it, a world with no printed books, no newspapers. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around, isn't it? Print is so woven into the fabric of our lives that we kind of forget it even has a history that literally shaped the modern world. So let's dig in and see how it all happened. So here's our game plan. We're going to start where it all began, way over in East Asia. Then we'll jump to Europe to talk about Gutenberg's massive breakthrough and the reading revolution that followed. And finally, we'll follow print as it arrives in India and see how it played a huge role in shaping our nation.
Okay, so our story kicks off in a place you might not expect. It's not Europe. The very first printing technologies actually came out of China, Japan, and Korea, centuries before they popped up anywhere else.
And just look at this timeline. It shows you just how early this stuff was happening. It all starts in China, way back in AD 594, with woodblock printing. From there, Buddhist missionaries carried the tech over to Japan, which led to the world's oldest printed book, the Diamond Sutra, in AD 868. Now think about this. It took almost another 400 years until Marco Polo came back in 1295 for this idea to even start making its way to Europe. So what were they actually printing back then? Well, in China, the government was a huge customer, churning out textbooks for their massive civil service exams. But by the 1600s, print wasn't just for scholars anymore. A new urban culture was hungry for stories, poems, and plays. Over in Japan, art took off in print, with cool illustrations of city life. And in Korea, you get the mind-blowing Tripitaka Koreana, a huge Buddhist text carved onto 80,000 woodblocks. Just an incredible feat. All right, let's hop over to Europe and see what's happening there. By the time knowledge of woodblock printing trickled in, people were already desperate for more books. But copying by hand was painfully slow, and woodblocks weren't much faster. Europe was ready for a major upgrade. So, before the printing press, Europe had manuscripts. These were books written completely by hand, usually on this fancy animal skin called vellum. And while they were often beautiful, they were also super fragile, incredibly expensive, and took ages to copy one by one. This meant knowledge was basically locked up, accessible only to a tiny, wealthy elite. And then came Johann Gutenberg in Germany. This guy was a genius. He basically took existing technologies and mashed them together in a brilliant new way. He saw how wine and olive presses worked and adapted that idea. He used his goldsmithing skills to create metal molds for each individual letter, and he put it all together to create the first movable type printing press. It was a total game changer. And if you want to understand the impact, just remember this one number, 180. That's how many copies of the Bible, the first book he printed, Gutenberg cranked out in about 3 years. Now, to us, that sounds pretty slow, right? But back in the 15th century, that was lightning fast. It would have taken a single scribe his entire life to do that. The era of mass-produced knowledge had officially begun. So now that you could make books quickly and cheaply, the world started to shift. And this wasn't just about new machines. It was a huge social and cultural revolution. It completely changed how people interacted with ideas and information. This here really shows you the before and after. Society went from being a hearing public, where stories and news were read aloud to a group, to a reading public. All of a sudden, you could own a book yourself, read it quietly, and form your own thoughts. Knowledge was no longer controlled by the person reading out loud. And you know who saw the power in this immediately? Religious reformers. Martin Luther, for example, used the printing press as his main weapon to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church. In 1517, his 95 Theses were printed and passed around everywhere, kickstarting the Protestant Reformation. He literally called print the ultimate gift of God because he knew it could spread his ideas like wildfire. But not everyone was thrilled about this. The people in charge, the church, the kings, they were terrified. They worried that if ordinary folks could read and think for themselves, it would lead to rebellion. And this fear led to crackdowns. The church launched its Inquisition and, starting in 1558, even kept a list of banned books, a direct effort to censor information and control what people were reading. All right, let's switch gears and bring the story over to India. Now, long before the printing press showed up, India had its own incredibly deep and ancient tradition of writing. India's manuscript tradition was just amazing, with texts in Sanskrit, Persian, and so many other languages. They were written on palm leaves or handmade paper and were often beautifully decorated. But just like in Europe, they were expensive and delicate, which meant they weren't really a part of everyday life for most people.
So here are the key moments for print's arrival in India. And these are great to remember for exams. The very first press landed in Goa with Portuguese missionaries in the mid-1500s. The first book in an Indian language, Tamil, came out in 1579. But things really took off in 1780 with India's first newspaper, the Bengal Gazette. And not long after, social reformers like Ramo and Roy started using this new tool to spread their ideas for a better society.
And this is where the story gets really powerful, because in 19th century India, print wasn't just a piece of technology anymore. It became an engine for debate, a voice for reform, and a critical tool in the fight for independence. The impact was just huge. Newspapers became arenas for public debate on everything from religion to social issues. New kinds of writing, like novels, let Indians see their own lives and stories in print. And so importantly, print gave a voice to people who didn't have one before. Women started writing and publishing, and cheap books meant that even the poor could start to access the world of reading. Well, as you can imagine, as these nationalist ideas started spreading through the local language press, the British colonial government got very, very nervous. Their answer was the Vernacular Press Act of 1878. This law basically gave them the power to shut down any native newspaper they didn't like. It was a clear and powerful move to try and silence dissent. But did it work? Not a chance. Even with the censorship, nationalist newspapers just kept growing. They bravely reported on the injustices of colonial rule and helped rally people to the freedom struggle. When the British jailed writers like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, it only led to more protests. Print had truly become an unstoppable force for Indian nationalism. And that brings us to the end of our story. The history of print shows us this constant push and pull, right? And new technology gives people a voice, and then the powers that be try to control that voice. Which leaves us with one last question to think about. In our own digital age of the internet and social media, where do you see that exact same battle between free expression and censorship playing out right now? Definitely something to consider. Thanks for watching.